The valley was calm until the sky turned orange and a farm became a roaring furnace. A retired Marine stood alone at the roadside, and the heat hit his face like a war he swore was over. Inside the burning barn, an entire herd slammed against gates, desperate hooves pounding for a way out. He ran in anyway, ripping latches open, guiding terrified cattle into the wind like steering fate itself. Then he heard it, a strangled breath under the crack of beams, and saw a German shepherd pinned beneath a fallen timber. The dog couldn't bark. It only stared, amber eyes locked on his like a hook pulling him back into the smoke. Would you have gone in too? Tell us where you're watching from, and please like, subscribe, and stay with us. Gideon Gus Hale was 50 and built like the kind of man the wind had tried to push around for decades and failed. About 6'1", broad-shouldered, sturdy, with tan skin and an angular face that looked carved from old oak. His short, dark brown hair was cut practical, silvering at the temples, and his very light stubble never quite decided whether it wanted to be a beard or a memory. People in town said his eyes were blue-gray, but that didn't capture the way they held depth, the way they sometimes stared past the present as if the past still sent postcards. He lived alone in a cabin outside Redwood Valley, Minnesota, where the mornings came bright and honest, and the evenings smelled of pine, cut hay, and cold lake water. He didn't own a dog, didn't keep a cat, didn't even keep a houseplant he'd have to apologize to when it wilted. It wasn't dislike. It was fire dressed up as discipline. Anything you love becomes something you can lose. And Gus had already learned that lesson in places where the sky didn't look like home. He wore the same outfit every day, like a uniform he chose for himself, an old brown earth-tone canvas jacket with a slightly scorched hem, a red-black flannel shirt beneath it, dark blue jeans, brown leather work boots, and an old military watch that ticked like a tiny metronome, insisting time still moved forward. That late afternoon he drove down the county road with the sun turning the fields into sheets of gold, his mind quiet in the way quiet men prefer, until his nose caught something wrong. Smoke didn't belong to the season's sweetness. Smoke didn't belong to a sky this clean. Then he saw it, a column of dark red-brown rising beyond the roll of pasture land, and beneath it the frantic shifting glow of flame. Redwood Valley's light turned suddenly mythic and brutal, like the sun had stumbled and fallen into a barn. Gus pulled over, listening with his whole body. The faint, far-off noise wasn't thunder. It was panic. Animals, wood cracking, metal singing as it heated. For a heartbeat, he thought about calling for help first, the way a normal man would. Then, he was already moving. He drove hard toward the Bishop Ranch, tires kicking gravel, heart clenched and releasing in that old habit, clenched and releasing, like it was practicing how to survive. The Bishop place sat open and wide, all bright pasture and practical fences, except now the world around it was a mouth of fire. A long, low barn and adjacent cattle-holding pens were burning with the relentless hunger of dry timber and wind. Smoke rolled across the yard, turning daylight into something bruised. Gus could hear cattle bellowing, deep, terrified sounds that weren't just noise, but language. Trapped, trapped, trapped. The heat slapped him as he jumped from the truck, and the air tasted like hot pennies. He ran toward the nearest pen, yanking at latches with hands that didn't hesitate. Hands that had learned in another life that hesitation was a luxury. The herd surged, bodies pressing, hooves striking boards, eyes white-rimmed and wild. He shoved the gate open and waved his arms, voice cutting through the roar. "Go on, move!" He didn't try to look heroic. He just tried to be useful. He kicked a loose plank aside, cleared a path, and angled his body so the cattle followed the least smoky corridor toward open pasture. The barn groaned, a sound like an old giant waking up angry. A roof beam cracked above him, and ash drifted down like black snow. Gus's mind did a cold inventory. Wind direction, exit routes, where the animals were bunching up. He could feel the burn on his cheeks, the sting on his wrists, and the small faded burn mark on his own wrist seemed to echo, as if his skin remembered fire before his brain could name it. A few cattle bolted past, stumbling, then catching their footing as the open field offered them a second chance. But the sound that stopped Gus mid-step wasn't a moo or a crack. It was a breath, ragged, wet, too close to be imagined. He followed it into the smoke, coughing once, then swallowing it down because coughing wasted time. There, half hidden by swirling gray, a German shepherd lay pinned under a fallen wooden beam near a side doorway, a place where the heat had pooled like anger. The dog was about 5 years old, male, large and muscular, even in defeat. Black and tan double coat dulled by ash. His upright ears were flattened not from fear, but from pain. His bright amber eyes locked onto Gus with a focus that didn't beg. It commanded. There was a smoke-darkened patch along his muzzle, a small lighter patch on his chest, like a stubborn star, and a healed, long scrape on his front leg that hinted this dog already knew what it meant to get back up. A small scar at his shoulder showed through the soot. Around his neck sat a dark brown leather collar, the metal tag slightly warped as if it had met heat before, and survived it. The dog didn't bark. He couldn't. His chest worked hard, each inhale a fight. Gus felt something in him, a hard, guarded place, flinch like a door that hadn't opened in years. "Hey," he said, softer than he meant, as if gentleness might keep the world from breaking further. He dropped to a knee, boots sinking into wet ash. The beam had the dog's shoulder and ribcage pinned at an angle that could ruin him if Gus pulled wrong. Gus slid his hands under the beam, tested the weight, the balance. It was heavy enough to make a younger man curse and a smarter man retreat. Gus was neither young nor retreating. He braced, jaw tight, muscles in his arms and back, drawing cords of pain, and lifted. The beam rose an inch, then another. The shepherd's eyes widened, not with panic, but with something like fierce permission. Gus shifted the beam onto a broken support post, bought himself a breath, then dragged the dog free, careful of the ribs, careful of the leg. The dog trembled, and Gus wrapped his scorched hem jacket around him without thinking, the way you wrap something precious so it doesn't shatter. The shepherd's nose pressed once against Gus's flannel, a brief, grounding touch. Then the dog tried to stand. "Nope," Gus muttered, and despite the chaos, the corner of his mouth twitched in that dry humor that showed up when the world got too serious. "You're not impressing anybody right now." He scooped the dog fully into his arms, surprised by the weight and by how natural it felt, like carrying a responsibility instead of a burden. Behind them, cattle poured into the field, black silhouettes against orange flame, and Gus forced himself to keep moving. One foot, then another, until he crossed the line where the heat eased and the smoke thinned. About a third of the way to the truck, the shepherd did something strange, something that didn't fit the simple story of man rescues dog. The dog's head lifted sharply, ears snapping upright despite the pain, and his amber eyes fixed on Gus's left sleeve. He sniffed hard, then let out a low, vibrating sound from his throat, a warning more than a whine. Gus paused, confused. The dog's nose pressed to the canvas jacket again, insistent, then turned toward the barn as if pointing. Gus followed the line of that gaze and felt his stomach drop for a different reason than the fire. The smoke wasn't just wood and hay. Under it, faint but unmistakable, was the sharp, chemical bite of gasoline, out of place on a ranch that stored diesel properly and didn't spill it like a careless teenager. Gus's mind flashed cold, an image of someone pouring, someone lighting, someone walking away while the animals screamed. He didn't have proof, not yet, but the dog's reaction was a kind of truth-telling, an animal's uncompromising honesty, a compass that didn't lie to be polite. The shepherd's warping tag glinted as he shifted, and for a brief, irrational second Gus thought, "This isn't just a rescue. This is a message, not supernatural in the cheesy way. Something older and simpler. Justice has a scent, and dogs can smell it long before men admit it exists." Gus's hand clenched and released. He swallowed the urge to run back into the inferno and hunt for a villain in the flames. Later, he told himself, and it sounded like a promise. First, we live. He carried the dog to the truck, laid him gently on the passenger side floor on a blanket Gus kept for emergencies he never wanted. And then, because Gus did not trust good luck, he drove straight to the nearest veterinary clinic with his hazard lights on, jaw set, eyes steady. The clinic was a small building on the edge of town where the bright late-day sun still made the siding look cheerful, as if the world hadn't just tried to burn down a ranch. Inside, everything smelled of antiseptic and wet fur, and the nervous sweat of people who love their animals more than they love their pride. Dr. May Whitaker met him at the door, mid-40s, medium build, short brown hair tucked behind her ears, glasses perched low on her nose like she was always reading the fine print of fate. She moved with calm speed, the kind you only earn by witnessing emergencies and refusing to panic. Over scrubs, she wore a white coat, but it wasn't pristine. It had the faint scuffs and ink marks of real work. Her eyes, brown, practical, kind without being sentimental, took in Gus's ash-smeared jacket, the dog's smoke-dark muzzle, and the tremor in Gus's hands he pretended wasn't there. "Fire?" she asked, already reaching for a gurney. Gus nodded once. He didn't offer a speech. He didn't need to. The shepherd tried to lift his head again, stubborn as a soldier, refusing to stay down. And Dr. Whitaker pressed 2 fingers to his gums, checked breathing, listened to the chest with a stethoscope, her face tightening at the sound. "Smoke inhalation," she murmured. "Possible bruising, maybe a fracture. We'll know more in a minute." She looked at Gus then, not accusing, not praising, just seeing him. "You got him out," she said. It wasn't a compliment. It was a fact, and somehow that made it heavier. Gus stood in the hallway while they worked, watching through a window as the shepherd was oxygen-masked and stabilized. He felt the old, familiar helplessness, waiting while someone else fights for a life, crawl up his spine. The dog's eyes found him even through the mask, and Gus did the one thing he never expected to do. He raised a hand and held it there, palm open, a quiet signal that he was still present. The dog's tail thumped once, tiny, weak, but real. Dr. Whitaker stepped out a while later, scribbling notes. "He's tough," she said. "He'll need rest, meds, and someone to keep him calm. For the next couple weeks, especially." Gus's first instinct was to say, "Not me." His second instinct, new, unwelcome, honest, was to ask, "Will he?" He didn't finish. Dr. Whitaker understood anyway. "He's going to make it," she said, "because you didn't leave him under that beam." Gus exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding since he first smelled smoke on the road. Night had settled by the time Gus drove back toward the Bishop Ranch, the shepherd sedated but alive, curled like a shadow made of fur and breath on the blanket. The ranch yard was crowded with exhausted motion, neighbors, volunteer firefighters, the glow of work lights, the grim choreography of cleanup. And there, near the edge of the field where the cattle had finally stilled into a trembling cluster, stood Warren Bishop. He was 62, lean tough, with salt and pepper hair kept neat even in disaster, a silver mustache that made him look both stern and oddly dignified, and deep brown eyes that carried the weight of a man who'd built a life with his hands and expected the world to respect it. His faded blue denim jacket was streaked with soot, his gray tee damp at the collar, and his brown work pants were dusted with ash. He moved with a slight slow gait, the kind of careful stride that comes from years of back pain and refusing to admit it. When he saw Gus step out of the truck, he didn't run up with theatrical gratitude. He walked over like a man approaching a fact he didn't want to forget. His calloused hands flexed once, unsure where to put themselves, on Gus's shoulder, on the truck door, into prayer. Gus opened the passenger door so Warren could see the dog. The shepherd's amber eyes cracked open, and his warped metal tag glinted again, catching the worklight like a small, stubborn coin of hope. Warren stared at him a long second, then at Gus, taking in the ash on Gus's face, the scorched hem of his jacket, the way his jaw was set in that disciplined line that said he'd do it again if the world asked. Warren's voice came out low, roughened by smoke and something like awe, and the sentence landed like a seal pressed into wax. If he chose you, don't make him an orphan again. The next morning arrived the way northern mornings like to arrive, bright, clean, almost offensively hopeful. Sunlight slid through the cabin windows and laid pale gold stripes across the worn floorboards, as if the world had decided last night's fire was none of its business anymore. Gus Hale stood at the sink with his sleeves pushed up, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. The backs of his knuckles were nicked, and his palms held that faint sting that came from heat and rough wood. He flexed his fingers, then did the thing he always did when emotion tried to speak first. He worked. He boiled water. He rinsed a rag. He set out a bowl he hadn't used in years, the kind of bowl that had no purpose in a one-man house. Then he paused, annoyed with himself, as if the bowl had appeared without permission. A soft sound from the couch corner answered him, a slow exhale, heavy and alive. The German shepherd lay on a blanket Gus had dragged from the closet, his large black and tan body curled tight, muscle-packed even in rest. His upright ears twitched at every creak of the cabin. The smoke-darkened patch along his muzzle made him look like he'd been kissed by ash, and his amber eyes, when they opened, carried that stubborn brightness that didn't belong to a victim. A small lighter patch on his chest rose and fell like a tiny lighthouse. The dark brown leather collar still circled his neck. The metal tag, slightly warped, clicked faintly when he shifted, an accidental bell reminding Gus there was now a second heartbeat in the room. Gus told himself it was temporary. He told himself a lot of things that morning. The truth was simpler and more inconvenient. The dog had followed him out of the fire, and some part of Gus, some sealed-off part, had followed the dog back. At the veterinary clinic, Dr. May Whitaker had been precise and unromantic about it. She was the kind of woman whose kindness never got in the way of competence. Mid-40s, medium build, short brown hair tucked behind her ears, brown eyes that held steady even when people didn't. Her glasses made her look like she was always measuring the world for cracks. She'd listened to the shepherd's lungs and watched the oxygen meter as if it were a tiny courtroom. Soft tissue trauma, she said, tapping her notes. Bruising, possibly a hairline fracture, but no obvious break. Smoke inhalation is the bigger concern. He needs calm, clean air, meds, and monitoring. Gus had stood there, ash still in his jacket seams, and tried to look like a man who wasn't about to be assigned a responsibility he didn't want to admit he could handle. He belongs to the Bishop Ranch, Gus said, because facts were safer than feelings. Dr. Whitaker glanced up, and for a second the clinic hallway seemed very quiet. He belongs to the thing that keeps him alive, she answered, voice gentle but firm. Right now, that seems to be you. Gus didn't like how true it sounded. Back at the ranch the night before, Warren Bishop had spoken his gratitude the way a man with calloused hands speaks it, briefly, like he was afraid too many words would cheapen the debt. Warren was 62, lean and tough, with salt and pepper hair kept neat out of stubborn pride, a silver mustache that made his mouth look perpetually unimpressed, and deep brown eyes that held more tired love than he'd ever say out loud. He stood with that slight careful gait that came from years of back pain and refusing to slow down. When Gus opened the truck door and Warren saw the dog breathing, sedated but alive, Warren's whole posture loosened, the way a fence loosens when the storm passes. Then came the sentence that sat in Gus's chest like a stone. If he chose you, don't make him an orphan again. Now, in the quiet cabin, the dog's eyes followed Gus with the same focused attention they'd had under the beam, as if the shepherd was still trying to confirm Gus was real and not just a rescue hallucination. Gus crouched beside him and read the medication label like it was a mission brief. "Okay," he muttered, not to the dog so much as to the universe. "We do this the right way." The shepherd blinked slowly, then thumped his tail once, soft against the blanket, a sound so small it felt like a secret handshake. Gus's mouth twitched. "Don't get cocky," he told the dog, and the tone was dry enough to pass for humor. The shepherd's ears flicked as if he understood sarcasm was the local language. Around mid-morning, a truck crunched up Gus's gravel drive. Gus stepped onto the porch, boots planted, shoulders squared, not hostile but guarded. He recognized the faded blue denim jacket and the old baseball cap with the ranch logo. Warren Bishop climbed out, and beside him came Elsie Bishop, late 50s to 60, warm and perceptive, with dark blonde hair threaded with silver and gathered in a low bun. She had a kind face that didn't mistake kindness for weakness, sharp eyes that noticed details, and a practical way of carrying herself, like she could carry both groceries and grief without dropping either. She wore a cream-thick sweater under an olive puffer jacket, black jeans, low boots, and because Elsie was Elsie, a brown apron even now, as if life always had flour on it somewhere. She held a small paper bag that smelled faintly of yeast and cinnamon. "Morning," Warren said, voice rough from smoke and sleeplessness. Elsie's smile softened the air. "We brought bread," she announced, as if bread could negotiate any awkwardness on earth. Gus nodded once, letting them onto the porch. He didn't invite people in often. The cabin wasn't messy, but it was private, like a mind you didn't want strangers wandering through. The shepherd lifted his head at the sound of voices. His body stayed low, but his ears stood tall, and a low, protective rumble flickered in his throat, not aggression, just vigilance. Warren stepped forward slowly. "Easy, boy," he murmured, but the dog's amber eyes weren't on Warren. They were on Gus, checking how Gus would respond. Gus surprised himself by saying, "It's okay." The shepherd settled, the rumble fading like a storm moving off. Elsie watched that exchange and didn't say "I told you so," but her eyes did it politely. Warren cleared his throat. "Doc said he needs calm," he began. "I can set up a spot in the house. Keep him close." The shepherd's head turned toward the open door behind Gus, and then back again, the movement quick, decisive. "No." Warren saw it too, and his jaw tightened with something that might have been pride or pain. "He won't come," Warren said quietly, not as a complaint, but as a fact he didn't know how to hold. Gus leaned against the porch post, the canvas of his jacket creasing at the scorched hem. "He's yours," Gus said. "I just got him out." Elsie stepped closer, voice soft but steady. "Honey," she said, and the word didn't sound patronizing. It sounded like someone trying to keep a man from walking off a cliff in his own head. "He didn't just get out. He got out with you." Gus's hand clenched, released. "I'm not a dog owner," he said, as if identity could be enforced like a boundary line. Elsie's eyes crinkled. "Funny," she replied, nodding toward the bandage supplies neatly stacked on the porch table. "Because you've got the hands of a man who's already been one all morning. Gus glanced down and realized he'd been organizing meds and gauze like a field medic. The irony stung. Warren exhaled, then made a decision the way ranchers make decisions, direct and fair. 2 weeks, he said. Temporary foster. We do it proper. Paperwork, check-ins, vet visits. If he calms down and wants to come back, he comes back. If he doesn't. He stopped, his eyes dropping to the shepherd's warped tag. If he doesn't, we don't fight what's already decided. That was a big sentence for Warren because it meant letting go of something he loved. Gus opened his mouth to refuse, but the shepherd shifted then, very carefully, and rested his chin on Gus's boot. The touch was light, almost respectful, but it landed hard. Gus felt the cabin behind him, empty and quiet, suddenly weighed down by the presence of that chin. He thought of the way the dog had looked at him under the beam, commanding, not pleading, and of the chemical smell the dog had caught on his sleeve, the strange insistence, the unspoken warning. The dog wasn't just wounded. He was watchful. Gus swallowed. 2 weeks, he said, like he was agreeing to repair a fence, not a life. Elsie pulled folded papers from the bag, along with a pen. I called Dr. Whitaker, she said. She said we could do a foster agreement through the clinic. That way it's official, and nobody can accuse anybody of anything. Gus took the pen. It felt ridiculous, signing papers in sunlight after surviving fire, but he understood paperwork. Paper was how the world pretended it could control chaos. He wrote his name carefully, the letters blocky and disciplined. Warren signed too, his hand steady despite exhaustion. Elsie added her signature, then tucked the forms back into the bag like she was packing away a fragile piece. The shepherd watched the whole thing, eyes half-lidded, but when Gus capped the pen, the dog's tail thumped once. Don't celebrate, Gus muttered. You're on probation. Elsie's laugh was soft and warm. Even Warren's mustache twitched, as close as that man got to a grin. They didn't stay long. Warren needed to check the cattle, the fence line, the charred skeleton of his barn. Elsie left the bread on the counter and touched Gus's arm briefly. One of those gestures that says, I see you without demanding anything in return. After they drove away, the cabin returned to its quieter rhythm, but it wasn't the same quiet. It had a pulse now, a second presence that listened. Gus spent the afternoon doing practical things. He placed a clean water bowl near the couch, then moved it 2 inches when the shepherd's eyes flicked toward the door, as if guarding needed a better sight line. He laid down another blanket near the front threshold, and the dog tested it with a paw, then, surprisingly, chose the spot beside the door instead of the couch. Guard position. Gus watched, feeling that unfamiliar pinch in his chest. The shepherd wasn't asking to be loved. He was offering to protect. That was a language Gus understood too well. Around late afternoon, Gus opened the back door to let in fresh air. The sun was still bright, turning the trees into green gold. The shepherd rose slowly, stiff but determined, and followed him onto the porch. Gus expected the dog to sniff the yard, maybe relieve himself, maybe wobble back inside. Instead, the shepherd froze, ears high, nose lifted, and drew in a long breath. His gaze locked on something beyond the trees, toward the direction of the Bishop Ranch. Then the dog did the second strange thing of the day. He took 2 steps, stopped, and looked back at Gus with an expression that wasn't a request. It was an instruction. Gus frowned. "What are you doing?" The shepherd's tail was low, body tense, like a compass needle caught by a magnet. He turned his head slightly, sniffing again. And there it was, faint but real. That same sharp chemical bite under the clean air, carried on the wind like a whisper of wrongdoing. Gus's stomach tightened, the dog's eyes narrowed, then he gave a low, steady growl, not angry, not scared. Certain. Gus stared out over the trees, sunlight bright and innocent, and felt the world tilt in a quiet way. If the air still carried that smell, if it hadn't come from last night's chaos, but from something ongoing, then the fire might not have been the end of the story. It might have been the beginning. Gus's hand clenched and released. He heard his own heartbeat, clear as a drum. The shepherd's warp tag clicked once as he shifted, as if punctuating the thought. Gus looked down at the dog, and for a second he saw something almost spiritual in the simple, fierce steadiness of that gaze. Not magic, not fantasy, but the kind of truth that feels like faith because it refuses to bend. Gus crouched, meeting the shepherd eye to eye. "Listen," he said quietly, voice rough. "You and me, we're not doing hero stuff. We're doing survival. You heal. I keep you safe. That's it." The dog blinked once, then pressed his nose briefly to Gus's wrist, the one with the old burn mark, like sealing a pact. Gus swallowed hard, surprised by the sting behind his eyes. "Yeah," he muttered, standing back up fast, as if movement could hide emotion. "Okay, 2 weeks." The shepherd turned and limped inside, settled by the door again, watching the world as if guarding Gus from something Gus couldn't yet name. Gus stood alone on the porch a moment longer, the northern light bathing everything in a forgiving glow, and realized the cabin wasn't empty anymore, not just of sound, but of meaning. He didn't call it ownership. He didn't call it love. He called it a duty, because duty was a word he could hold without breaking. Inside, the dog's breathing steadied, slow and strong, and Gus let himself believe, just for that breath, that maybe some rescues were not accidents. Maybe some were assignments. 2 days after the fire, the Bishop Ranch looked like a man trying to stand up after being knocked flat. In the bright northern sun, the charred skeleton of the barn was almost too honest. Blackened beams, angled like broken ribs, patches of white foam crusted on the ground, and a sour burn smell that clung to everything, no matter how much wind came off the lake. Gus kept his cabin quiet on purpose, but quiet had turned complicated. The German shepherd, still legally the ranch dog on paper, had made the cabin's front doorway his post, lying with his broad chest toward the door and his amber eyes tracking every sound. The dog's black and tan coat was dulled with lingering soot. The smoke-darkened patch on his muzzle made him look like a survivor who didn't bother polishing the evidence. He moved stiffly, favoring the leg that had taken the beam, but his mind was fast. His ears were always up, his gaze always measuring. His dark brown leather collar sat snug at his neck, and the warped metal tag clicked softly when he shifted. An accidental metronome reminding Gus that time didn't pause for trauma. Gus had tried not to name the dog, as if refusing a name could keep a bond from forming. It hadn't worked. The bond was already there, stitched in that moment under the beam. Gus drove to the ranch early, the dog riding on the passenger floor with a blanket and a calm that looked like discipline. The morning light made the fields look almost forgiving. The ranch itself did not. Warren Bishop was already working, his lean frame moving with stubborn purpose, despite the slight slow gait from back pain. He wore the same faded denim jacket, gray tee, brown work pants, and black rubber boots, his old ranch logo cap shading deep brown eyes that had seen too much loss in too short a time. He didn't greet Gus with speeches. He nodded like a man acknowledging another man's presence in the only way he trusted, by putting him to work. Elsie Bishop moved in and out of the farmhouse doorway with her brown apron on like armor, her olive puffer and cream sweater catching the breeze. Her hair, dark blonde streaked with silver, stayed in a low bun that never seemed to loosen even when the world did. She gave Gus a thermos of coffee and a look that said she knew he hadn't slept properly since the fire, even if he'd never admit it. "Fire marshal's coming," Warren said, voice rough. "County wants an official cause." Gus glanced toward the burned barn. "Good," he answered, and surprised himself with the force in the word. He didn't care about paperwork for its own sake. He cared because the dog's nose had caught gasoline where gasoline didn't belong, and because the world had trained Gus to trust patterns more than promises. A white SUV rolled in around mid-morning and parked with careful distance from the debris. A man stepped out who looked like he belonged to a different kind of weather. Neat, controlled, almost too clean for a ranch. He was in his late 40s to early 50s, average height, fit but not bulky, with sandy hair clipped close, and a trimmed mustache that made his face look perpetually serious. His skin was fair, sun-touched but not sun-worn, and his eyes were a sharp gray that didn't waste time. He wore a dark utility jacket over a collared shirt, work boots that had never met mud by accident, and a badge clipped where it could be seen without being flashy. This was Fire Marshal Grant Hensley, a man who'd built his personality around facts because facts didn't betray you. People said he'd lost a cousin in a house fire years back. Whether or not that was true, he carried that kind of quiet severity, like every scene was personal even when he never admitted it. He shook Warren's hand, then Gus's, then took in the ruined barn with a gaze that measured angles and soot patterns like reading scripture. "You were first on scene?" Hensley asked Gus. Gus nodded once. "Yes." "Walk me through it," Hensley said, already pulling out a small notebook. Gus didn't dramatize. He gave the time, the wind direction, the sound of cattle bunching at the pen, the position of the worst flames, the way the fire climbed unnaturally fast along the side nearest the hay storage. Hensley wrote without looking up much, as if eye contact might contaminate evidence. "Accelerant possible," he murmured, more to himself than anyone. The German shepherd stood near Gus's leg, not crowding, simply present, his posture calm, but coiled. When Hensley stepped toward the hay area, the dog's ears snapped forward. His muzzle lifted, and his body stiffened so suddenly, Gus felt it in his own bones. The dog let out a low, steady growl, not loud, not threatening, but certain, like a warning bell that didn't care if anyone wanted to hear it. Hensley paused, glancing down at him. "Working dog?" he asked Warren. Warren exhaled. "Guard dog." "Was," he corrected quietly. Hensley crouched a few feet away, not reaching, studying. "He's reacting to something," Hensley said, voice flat but attentive. The dog took 2 stiff steps, nose down, and began scratching at a patch of ash near the barn's side wall. Not random scrabbling, deliberate, focused. His claws scraped, and the warped tag on his collar clicked with every movement. Gus's breath caught. The dog's behavior wasn't fear, it was accusation. Hensley moved in, careful not to step where the dog indicated. He pulled on gloves, used a small metal tool to sift ash, and after a minute he uncovered a damp, darkened patch in the soil, the kind that didn't fit ordinary barn debris. He lifted it to his nose, then immediately held it away, expression tightening. "That," Hensley said, voice dropping, "smells like gasoline." Warren's face went still, as if something inside him had snapped into a colder alignment. Elsie pressed a hand to her mouth, her sharp eyes suddenly wet. Gus felt his fist clench and release. It wasn't proof enough to convict someone yet, but it was proof enough to change the story from tragedy to crime. Hensley stood, looking between Warren and Gus. "I'm going to bag samples," he said, "and I'm going to ask some questions nobody likes." The dog stopped scratching and looked up at Gus. His amber eyes seemed to say, "Now you see it too." Gus looked back, and some deep place in him, something that had been asleep, stirred awake. The rehook came later, when the ranch had settled into a tense afternoon and people were trying to act normal in the ruins. Gus was helping Warren stack salvaged boards when the German shepherd suddenly left his post and limped toward the open pasture. Not running, not panicking, moving like he'd received an order only he could hear. Gus followed, irritated despite himself. "Hey," he called, keeping his voice low so he wouldn't spook the cattle. The dog didn't stop. He headed toward the fence line near the road, then paused, ears pricked. A car passed, dark, unfamiliar, moving a little too slow for a county road. The dog's body tightened, and he stared at it with a focus that made Gus's skin prickle. As the car rolled by, the dog let out a short, sharp bark, one single note that cut the air like a snapped wire. The car's brake lights flashed for half a second, then it accelerated. Gus's heart thudded. The dog turned and pressed his nose to the gravel where the tires had thrown dust, sniffing hard. Then he looked back at Gus again, and Gus understood the unsettling truth. The dog wasn't just traumatized by fire. The dog was recognizing a threat, recognizing a presence, as if whoever started the fire had come back to see what remained. For a moment, the sunlight felt less like comfort and more like a spotlight. Gus had the strange, sober sense of being watched, not by spirits or superstition, but by greed wearing human skin. He walked back to Warren with the dog beside him, and his voice came out rough. "Someone drove by slow," Gus said. "Didn't look like a neighbor." Warren's jaw tightened. "They've been sniffing around," he admitted, "for months. Offers, threats, sell before you lose everything." Elsie's laugh came out bitter, the humor drained. "As if we hadn't already lost enough." That was when the name finally stepped out from behind the curtain. Cole Bishop arrived the next morning, but he arrived in Gus's thoughts first. Warren had spoken of his son as if talking about a weather system, distant, inevitable, sometimes dangerous. When Cole's rental SUV pulled in, it looked too clean, too city, too sure of itself. Cole stepped out with a tall, lean, athletic build and the kind of neat black haircut that said he trusted schedules. His face was handsome in a tense way, jaw set, eyes brown and sharp, scanning damage like he was already calculating costs and blame. He wore a charcoal wool coat over a black turtleneck, dark khaki pants, brown leather shoes, and black leather gloves, city armor on ranch ground. A plain ring sat on his hand, not flashy, more like a reminder he belonged to something that expected him to succeed. His expression softened briefly when he saw Warren, then hardened again when his gaze landed on Gus. "Who's this?" Cole asked, voice controlled but edged. Warren introduced Gus plainly, no embellishment. Cole's eyes traveled over Gus's scorched hem jacket, his ash-stained boots, his blue-gray stare that didn't flinch. "So you're the one who ran into the fire," Cole said, and it sounded less like gratitude and more like suspicion. Gus didn't defend himself. He'd learned long ago that explaining your good deeds to someone determined to doubt them was like trying to shovel smoke. The German shepherd stepped forward, stiff-legged but steady, placing himself slightly between Gus and Cole. Not aggressive, just positioned, like a living boundary line. Cole's gaze dropped to the dog. "That's our dog," he said, a possessive emphasis on our. The shepherd's ears stayed up, but he didn't move toward Cole. His amber eyes remained on Gus's hand, as if his loyalty was already assigned. Cole's nostrils flared, a quick sign of irritation. "He's injured," Cole snapped. "He should be at home." Elsie's voice cut in, calm but firm. "He is safe," she said. "He's getting care, and he's calmer with Gus." Cole looked at his mother, then back at Gus. "Calmer," he repeated, tasting the word like it offended him. Warren's shoulders sagged a fraction. "Son," he said quietly, "there's gasoline under the ash." That got Cole's attention. His eyes narrowed. "Meaning?" Hensley's SUV rolled in as if summoned by the tension. The fire marshal stepped out, carrying sealed evidence bags. He greeted Cole with the same factual restraint he offered everyone. "Meaning accelerant," Hensley said. "Meaning this might not be an accident." Cole stared at the burned barn again, and for the first time His city confidence cracked into something raw, fear maybe, or anger. He turned back to Gus. "And you just happened to be there," he said, and the accusation landed sharp. Gus felt the old urge to retreat, to avoid conflict, but something new anchored him, the weight of a dog's trust. "I happen to smell smoke," Gus said evenly. "That's it." The shepherd's tag clicked as he shifted, and he let out a quiet huff, almost dismissive. Elsie, despite everything, murmured, "He doesn't like drama," and for a heartbeat the tension loosened, a small thread of humor trying to stitch the room back together. That night, the sabotage proved it wasn't just talk. A section of fence along the road was cut clean, not by storm or animal, but by tool. Near midnight, cattle began to drift, confused and nervous, toward the gap, drawn by the open dark like water toward a crack in a dam. Gus heard it before anyone else, the faint clatter, the restless lowing, and the German shepherd was already on his feet, ears forward, body moving with purpose, despite the limp. Gus grabbed a flashlight and ran. The pasture was moonlit and bright, the northern sky scattered with stars that looked indifferent. The cattle were moving as a heavy, slow wave toward the road. One wrong spill onto asphalt, and the whole ranch could drown in tragedy again. Gus didn't shout wildly. He used his voice like a tool, low and commanding. "Hey, hey, back, back!" The German shepherd circled wide, keeping distance from hooves, using posture and presence the way good herding dogs do even if they weren't trained for it. He angled his body, blocked the lead animals, and pushed the herd's front edge away from the gap. Gus found the cut fence and swore under his breath, not loud enough to scare the cattle, but enough to satisfy the universe that he was still human. Warren arrived, breath hard, boots thudding. Cole followed, face pale, city gloves useless against wire. For the first time, Cole didn't accuse. He just stared at the moving herd and the limping shepherd, controlling it like an old professional. "He's doing that hurt," Cole said, voice stunned. Gus didn't take the moment to win. He took it to act. Together they guided the cattle back into the safe interior of the pasture, then wired a temporary fix on the fence under flashlight beams. Hensley arrived later, took photos, shook his head once as if tired of people's cruelty. "This is escalation," he said. "Someone wants you scared. Someone wants you to sell." Warren's eyes were dark. "I won't," he said simply. Gus stood there, wire biting his fingers, and felt the German shepherd press briefly against his leg. A grounding touch. A silent confirmation. "You're not alone in this now." By dawn, Gus installed cameras, nothing fancy, just practical. He mounted them high, angled them toward the road, the barn debris, the fence line. It wasn't heroism. It was a gate lock for truth. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew it. Whoever lit that fire had underestimated two things: how stubborn a ranch family could be, and how honest a dog's nose was. The sun rose over Redwood Valley again, bright and clean as if nothing had happened, but Gus no longer trusted sunlight to mean safety. He trusted work. He trusted evidence. And against all his old rules, he trusted the warm, steady presence of a German shepherd who had stepped out of fire and chosen him like a promise nobody had named yet. The first winter after the fire came softly, almost politely, as if the sky wanted to apologize for what the earth had endured. Snow dusted the fence posts and turned the fields into quiet pages, and the Bishop Ranch, patched and rebuilt in stubborn stages, began to breathe again. Gus Hale kept his cabin the way he kept his heart, simple, orderly, and at a careful distance from other people's expectations. He still slept under his own roof most nights, still woke before dawn to the tick of his old military watch, still wore the same brown canvas jacket with the slightly scorched hem, the same red-black flannel, the same jeans and boots that made him look like a man built for work rather than comfort. But his days belonged to the ranch now. He drove down the county road while frost glittered on the grass, and each morning the German shepherd, no longer sedated, no longer trembling, rode in steady silence, a large black and tan presence that filled the passenger side space like a promise that refused to be dismissed. The dog had healed in the way working animals heal, not by forgetting pain but by building strength around it. His limp faded to a slight stiffness on cold mornings. The healed scrape along his front leg remained a pale reminder under fur. The smoke-darkened patch on his muzzle stayed, giving his face a permanent, half-suited seriousness, and the small lighter patch on his chest flashed whenever he shifted in sunlight, like a tiny flame refusing to go out. His amber eyes remained bright and unnervingly aware. The dark brown leather collar and warped metal tag never left his neck, and Gus never replaced them with anything new, as if the old tag was part of the dog's story, and therefore part of Gus's duty. At first, people in town called him the Fire Dog, like it was a nickname you could wear for free. Then they stopped calling him anything and started watching him instead, because the dog didn't act like a pet. He acted like a compass with muscles. Gus still tried not to call it love. He called it responsibility, because responsibility didn't threaten him with loss the way love did. The ranch needed that responsibility. Warren Bishop's back pain worsened as the months passed, and the man's deep brown eyes grew more tired. He remained lean and tough, his silver mustache making him look stern even when his voice softened. But he began to move slower, careful with each step, as if he were negotiating with his own bones. Elsie Bishop kept the ranch's heart beating, warm and perceptive, dark blonde hair, silver-threaded in a low bun, her apron always on, her sharp eyes catching every small shift in people's moods. She was the one who made sure the crews ate, the neighbors felt thanked, and the world didn't forget that pride and kindness could share the same kitchen table. Cole Bishop, at first, stayed mostly in the city. When he came home, he came like a man visiting a museum of his own childhood. Hands in gloves, mind calculating, face tense under the neat black hair and charcoal coat. He never admitted he was scared, but fear lived in the way he watched the repaired barn and the camera poles near the fence line, as if he expected the past to strike again. Gus didn't try to win Cole over. He didn't have the energy for persuasion. He just kept doing the work that needed doing, fixing gates, hiring welders, keeping receipts, paying laborers on time with an honesty so plain it almost looked old-fashioned. When a neighboring family's milking machine broke and they couldn't afford a new part, Gus quietly delivered a spare valve and left before anyone could make gratitude awkward. When a widow down the road couldn't drive after surgery, Elsie delivered food and Gus repaired her porch steps without announcing it. Warren watched those things the way ranch owners watch weather, silently, deeply, remembering. Over time, the German Shepherd became the ranch's unofficial warning system. He could hear an engine long before human ears picked it up, his upright ears snapping toward distant sound while people still joked and sipped coffee. He could detect sickness in cattle before symptoms became visible, lingering near a cow whose breathing had changed, nudging her flank, staring until Gus noticed. Gus learned to trust that stare. The dog's instincts weren't theatrical. They were precise. And the most unsettling precision of all came when Gus had his bad moments. Some nights, after a day of hard labor and quiet conversation, Gus would stop speaking entirely. His jaw would set, his gaze would drift somewhere far beyond the ranch. The air around him would go thin, like oxygen leaving a room. Those were the nights the past came back, not as story, but as sensation. Gus had never told anyone the details of what the war had taken from him, because he didn't want pity, and he didn't want questions. But the dog seemed to recognize the shift the way a sailor recognizes a storm by pressure in the bones. The shepherd would approach without noise, press his smoke-dark muzzle against Gus's wrist, always the wrist with the faint old burn mark, and hold there until Gus's breathing slowed and his hand unclenched. It was grounding without drama, a living anchor. Elsie once saw it happen by accident and didn't make a big deal of it. She only said softly, "He knows where you keep the pain, doesn't he?" Gus had stared at her, startled by the accuracy, and answered with his usual dry deflection. "He's nosy." Elsie smiled like she understood deflection was sometimes the only way men survived. The rehook arrived in the second year on a bright spring day when the pasture looked almost too alive. Gus was checking a fence line with the dog trotting beside him, tail low but relaxed. The air smelled of thawed earth and fresh grass, the kind of smell that makes you believe in second chances. They were near the rebuilt hay storage when the German shepherd suddenly stopped. His body stiffened, ears high, and he lowered his head to the ground, as if listening to a secret buried under soil. Then he began to dig, not frantic, not playful, deliberate. Gus frowned, stepping closer. "What is it?" The dog dug until his paws hit something hard. He nudged it with his nose and backed away, staring. Gus knelt and brushed away dirt, and his fingers touched cold metal. He pulled free a small, rusted object, an old disposable lighter, half crushed, its plastic scarred by heat, and faintly stamped with a logo that didn't belong on a ranch supply item. Gus's stomach tightened with a memory from that first week after the fire when the dog had barked once at a slow-moving car. For a moment the sunshine felt like a lie, and the pasture seemed to hold its breath. Gus didn't tell Warren immediately, not because he wanted to hide it, but because he suddenly understood how fragile hope was in a family that had already been pushed to the edge. He bagged the lighter, photographed the location, and called Fire Marshal Grant Hensley with a voice that stayed calm even as something cold moved behind his ribs. "I found something," Gus said. Hensley came out the next day, gray-eyed and severe as ever, took the evidence with careful gloved hands, and didn't promise miracles. "It helps," he said. "It doesn't end it." When Warren heard, he didn't explode. He simply went very quiet, the way men go quiet when anger becomes a fuel of its own. "So they never stopped," Warren said. Gus shook his head. "Maybe they never will," he answered. The dog stood between them, not moving, as if he had planted himself as a living statement. Not here, not again. That moment changed the ranch's culture. The cameras stayed. The neighbors formed an informal watch. People who once thought Gus was an outsider began waving at him with a new respect, not because he was charming, but because he was consistent. Cole, too, shifted. In the third year, he started coming home more often. He traded his city-perfect shoes for boots when he could, though he still looked like a man borrowed from a different world. Charcoal coat, black turtleneck, gloves, ring gleaming faintly when sunlight hit it. He began asking practical questions instead of suspicious ones. "How much did the welders cost?" "What's the insurance timeline?" "Did we update the fencing quotes?" Gus answered without condescension, because condescension was useless, and slowly Cole's fear turned into something more useful, responsibility. The German shepherd helped in his own blunt way. The dog didn't fawn over Cole. He watched him. When Cole spoke honestly, the dog's posture softened. When Cole's voice tightened with frustration, the dog's amber eyes fixed on him in a way that was unnerving, like a silent reminder. Lies and posturing were a waste of breath. Cole once muttered, half irritated, half amazed, "That dog judges me." Gus replied, deadpan, "He's got good taste." Even Cole laughed, and the sound was awkward but real. By the fourth year, Warren's health became the quiet shadow at the edge of every good day. He didn't announce his decline. He just started sitting down more. His hands, those calloused hands that had built a life, began to tremble sometimes when he lifted heavy buckets. Elsie noticed first, of course. She always did. She made appointments without fanfare, adjusted meals, folded worry into her apron like it belonged there. Warren finally admitted to Gus one evening, standing in the doorway of the farmhouse with dusk settling on the fields. "There's something on my scans," he said. The words came out plain, but his eyes betrayed him, tired, resigned, quietly angry at his own body. Gus didn't offer empty comfort. He only nodded once, as if acknowledging an order. "What do you need?" he asked. Warren's mouth tightened with something like relief. "I need the ranch to stay standing," Warren said, "for Elsie, for Cole, for the people who depend on it." Gus looked out over the pasture where the German shepherd was lying near the gate, watchful even in rest. "It will," Gus said. He didn't say how, he just meant it. The 5th year arrived with a bright summer that made the world look simpler than it was. Warren's condition worsened. Treatments began to steal his strength in small increments. Yet he still walked the property when he could, slow gait slower now, hat brim shading his eyes. Cole was home more than he was away. The ranch, paradoxically, grew steadier, because Gus had become its spine, and Cole had begun learning what it meant to carry weight without complaining. Gus still returned to his cabin at night, still kept his distance from town gossip, still refused to call himself anything grand. But everyone on that land knew the truth. Gus wasn't there to take. Gus was there to hold. One late afternoon, Warren asked Gus to come to the farmhouse kitchen. Elsie was there, hands folded over her apron, eyes sharp but tender. Cole stood by the window, tense in his charcoal coat, as if bracing for impact. A man Gus didn't recognize sat at the table with a leather briefcase and a polite, careful smile. A lawyer with salt and pepper hair combed neatly back, a clean-shaven jaw, and calm eyes that looked practiced at holding other people's grief without drowning in it. His suit was understated, his posture respectful, the kind of man who didn't enjoy conflict but understood it was part of his job. Warren introduced him as Attorney Miles Carden. "We're going to do this right," Warren said, voice firm, despite the weakness behind it. "No surprises, no knives in the dark. A plan." Gus's throat tightened. Plans were meant to prevent loss. They rarely succeeded. Yet as the lawyer opened his folder and Elsie reached for Warren's hand, the German shepherd walked into the doorway, stood there with his head high, and watched the room like a sentinel. His warped tag clicked once, a soft punctuation that sounded, to Gus, like the beginning of something inevitable. Warren met Gus's eyes and spoke quietly, almost kindly. "You helped us stand back up," he said. "Now we build railings so nobody falls when I'm gone." Gus didn't know what to say, so he did what he always did when emotions got too large. He nodded and stayed. Warren Bishop died in green grass season, when the pasture looked so alive it felt almost cruel. The sky that morning was a bright northern blue, the kind that makes you believe nothing bad can happen. And that was the insult of it. Life continuing in beauty while a man slipped away in a quiet hospital room with his wife's hand in his and his son trying not to break in front of him. Gus Hale didn't dress up for grief. He wore the same brown canvas jacket with the slightly scorched hem, the same red-black flannel, the same dark jeans and brown boots, because grief didn't deserve a costume, and he didn't believe in pretending. His face, with its square jaw and very light stubble, looked carved harder than usual. The small faded burn mark on his wrist seemed darker against the pale hospital light. He stood at the back of the room, shoulders broad, hands clenching and releasing, the old habit trying to do something with feeling. Warren lay thinner than Gus had ever seen him. Silver mustache now, a faint line above a mouth that had spoken so little but meant so much. Even in weakness, Warren's presence filled the space like a fence line, steady, protective. Elsie sat close, dark blonde hair silvered and pinned in that familiar low bun, her cream sweater and olive puffer folded beside the chair like she'd arrived ready to keep him warm and hadn't accepted she couldn't. Her eyes, sharp and kind, were red but unblinking. She had spent years being the ranch's heart. Now she was doing the hardest work of all, letting the heart lose its oldest beat without collapsing. Cole stood near the window, tall and lean, his neat black hair slightly disordered for the first time Gus could remember. His charcoal coat hung on him like city armor that didn't fit in a room this honest. The plain ring on his hand caught the light as he rubbed his thumb over it, over and over, a nervous loop. He looked at his father with a face tight with grief and guilt, the kind of grief men often mistake for anger, because anger feels more useful. Warren's last words, when they came, were simple. He didn't give speeches. He wasn't a man built for poetry. He glanced at Gus once, and in that glance was a whole season of trust. Then he looked at Elsie, and his expression softened into something like gratitude. "You keep them steady," he murmured, voice so thin it was more breath than sound. Elsie leaned in, forehead touching his, and whispered something private that sounded like a promise and a prayer braided together. Warren's breathing slowed, then stopped, and the room did what rooms do when a person leaves it forever. Everything stayed in place, yet nothing was the same. Gus didn't cry in front of people. He never had. But he felt the loss in his chest like a quiet collapse, like a beam giving way. The German shepherd was not allowed in the hospital, but he waited in the truck outside, and Gus could almost feel that amber gaze through the windshield, steady as a lighthouse. The funeral took place under a sun that refused to dim. The pasture behind the church rolled green and bright, cattle lowing in the distance as if the ranch itself was singing a sad hymn. People came from miles around, neighbors who had taken milk in hard times, workers who'd been paid fairly when other ranch owners cut corners, families who remembered Warren's quiet help when their own barns needed repair. Elsie stood straight, apron absent for once, dressed simply, still practical, still herself. Cole held her arm, posture stiff, jaw clenched. Gus stood a respectful distance away, not because he was aloof, but because he didn't know where he belonged in this kind of family grief. The German shepherd stayed near Gus's leg, calm, tail low, ears alert. He was older now, his body fully recovered, the black and tan coat glossy again, except for the smoke-darkened patch on his muzzle that never fully faded. The small lighter patch on his chest flashed whenever he breathed in sunlight. The warped metal tag clicked softly when he shifted his weight, a tiny sound like a clock that kept time even when people wished it wouldn't. The rehook arrived not in the funeral, but in the quiet after, when grief turned into paperwork, and the world tried to translate a life into signatures. A week after the burial, Elsie asked Gus to come to the farmhouse. Cole was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with attorney Miles Carden, and a second man Gus didn't recognize. Tall, narrow-shouldered, and unsettlingly smooth. The stranger looked like he belonged in an office tower, not a farmhouse. Late 40s, pale skin that had never met hard sun, slicked back dark hair, clean-shaven face with sharp cheekbones, and a smile that never reached his eyes. He wore a charcoal overcoat that matched Cole's palette, but felt colder, and his hands, long-fingered, immaculate, rested on the table as if he owned the wood. His eyes were a watery gray, constantly measuring. Attorney Carden introduced him as Victor Sloan, a representative for Horizon Development, and the name landed like a rock in a well. Horizon had been the shadow behind the ranch's troubles for years, offers that became threats, polite letters that carried knives between the lines. Victor's voice was smooth, pleasantly flat, the voice of a man who could ruin you and still say, "Have a nice day." "Mrs. Bishop," Victor began, Mr. Bishop, he nodded to Cole, then looked at Gus like Gus was a piece of equipment. We're sorry for your loss. Truly. Horizon believes in honoring local families. Gus nearly laughed at the line, but his humor turned bitter in his throat. The German shepherd, lying near the doorway, lifted his head. His ears snapped forward. His amber eyes locked onto Victor, with a focus so sharp it made the hair rise on Gus's arms. The dog's lips pulled back slightly, not a snarl, but a warning, a silent declaration. Liar. Victor noticed the dog and smiled wider, as if amused. Lovely animal, he said. He seems protective. Cole's jaw tightened. He does his job, Cole replied curtly. Victor slid a folder across the table. Horizon is prepared to make an enhanced offer, he said, given the recent tragedies and the challenges of maintaining a large operation. Elsie didn't touch the folder. Her sharp eyes stayed on Victor's face. We're not selling, she said, voice steady. Grief turned into steel. Victor's smile didn't change. Of course, he said. Not selling, not today. We're simply discussing options. Attorney Carden cleared his throat gently. The Bishop estate is now held in a farm trust, he said. He said, calm and precise. The terms are clear. Victor's eyes flicked, the first sign of annoyance. Trusts can be challenged, he replied lightly, especially if there are questions about undue influence. His gaze slid to Gus. The insinuation was a thin, poisonous thread. Gus felt his hand clench and release. He said nothing, because he refused to dance for Victor's satisfaction. The German shepherd rose then, slow and deliberate, and walked to stand directly between Gus and Victor. Not aggressive, just positioned. His warped tag clicked once, like punctuation. Victor's smile faltered for half a heartbeat. In that flicker, Gus saw it, the truth hiding behind the suit, fear of being seen. Victor left soon after, but the air in the kitchen stayed tense. Cole exploded the moment the door closed. He's going to come after this, Cole said, voice shaking with anger. He's going to drag us into court. He's going to bleed us until we can't afford to keep the ranch. Elsie's hands trembled, but her voice remained calm. Your father planned for this, she said. That's why he called Miles. That's why he made railings. Attorney Carden opened the trust documents again, speaking in plain language rather than legal fog. Warren designed the trust to protect the land from predatory acquisition, he explained. There are restrictions on sale, rights of first refusal, and structured ownership. Gus retains management authority with oversight. Cole has defined equity and profit participation. Nobody gets pushed out. Cole stared at the papers, then at Gus. Management authority, he repeated, tasting the words like he wasn't sure whether to hate them. Gus finally spoke, voice low. I don't want your father's chair, he said. I want the ranch to stay standing. That's what Warren asked. Cole's eyes narrowed. And why should I trust you? He asked, the old suspicion trying to resurrect itself. Gus didn't flinch. You shouldn't, he answered simply. Trust the work. The German shepherd stepped closer to Cole. Then, head slightly lowered, amber eyes steady. He didn't demand affection. He offered presence. Cole swallowed, startled, as if the dog's calm was a mirror showing him the truth. This wasn't about ownership. It was about loyalty. 2 months later, the fight moved from kitchen table to courthouse corridors and state offices. Fire Marshal Grant Hensley's investigation, combined with the ranch's camera footage, began to paint a picture too clear for Horizon to hide behind politeness. One night, a camera near the rebuilt hay storage caught headlights creeping along the fence line. Another camera caught a figure in a hood near the road, tall, moving with quick purpose, placing something near the gate. The German shepherd had woken Gus before the footage even mattered, growling low, nose pressed to the door, as if danger had a smell. Gus found a small container, an accelerant can, half hidden in brush, a clumsy attempt to frame the ranch or set up another accident. Gus didn't play hero. He called Hensley. Hensley arrived with 2 state investigators, men in plain jackets with eyes that looked tired of human greed. They documented everything, took fingerprints, pulled camera data. The state's interest sharpened after that. Horizon's enhanced offers stopped arriving. Their phone calls became shorter. Then, abruptly, Horizon's presence thinned, like smoke sucked away by wind. Attorney Carden returned to the farmhouse one evening with a weary smile. "They're withdrawing," he said, "not out of kindness, out of fear. The state doesn't like patterns of intimidation tied to arson." Elsie exhaled like someone who had been holding her breath for years. Cole stared at the sunset through the window, his face softening into something older and sadder. "Dad knew," he murmured. "He knew they'd come." Gus nodded. "He built railings," Gus replied. "He didn't leave you a trap." The ranch's official recognition as protected agricultural heritage came later, an acknowledgement from the county that the Bishop land held historical and community value, making it harder for corporate pressure to squeeze it cheap. People in town celebrated quietly, the way northern towns do: potluck dinners, handshakes, a few tears disguised as laughter. Gus didn't attend the celebration for praise. He attended because Elsie asked, and because staying was something he was learning. In the final scene, Gus stood in front of the newly built cattle shelter, wood clean and strong, the kind of structure that promised endurance. The German shepherd sat beside him, posture upright, ears alert, amber eyes watching the pasture as if guarding not just cattle, but meaning. The warped tag on his collar caught the last light and flashed once like a tiny coin offered to the sky. Gus rested his hand on the dog's shoulder, feeling the muscle and warmth there, and something in him loosened. He thought of the vow he'd never spoken aloud but had lived by: never own a dog, never risk the ache of attachment. Fate apparently had laughed at that vow with gentle cruelty and better intentions. Gus had not rescued the dog alone. The dog had rescued the part of Gus that had been living like a shut door. Under the bright northern sun, with grass singing in the breeze and the ranch breathing steady again, Gus finally let the truth settle without fighting it. He wasn't keeping a dog. He was being kept, held to the world by a living compass that had stepped out of fire and refused to let him turn away. Sometimes the miracle is not a wall of fire parting or a voice from the sky. Sometimes it is a single life placed in someone's arms at the exact moment a heart has decided it will never love again. In that northern sunlight, it becomes clear that God's answers often arrive quietly. A door held open, a breath protected, a loyal creature who refuses to let a wounded soul stay buried in ash. And maybe that is how heaven works in ordinary days, not by removing every hardship, but by sending us a reason to stand up inside it. If you are watching this with your own heavy season, remember this: God can rebuild a person the same way a ranch is rebuilt, plank by plank, morning by morning, through small acts of courage that look like routine until you realize they saved you. So tonight, if you can, do one small good thing. Speak one gentle word. Offer one hand. Because the love you give away is often the love God uses to bring you back to life. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and tell us where you're watching from and what you're carrying. And subscribe for more stories of loyalty, healing, and second chances. May the Lord bless you, protect your home, strengthen your heart in the quiet battles no one sees, and guide you into a new morning filled with mercy.